José Ramos was Manuel Ramos's eldest son. While serving under Bento Gonçalves da Silva during the Ragamuffin War, his father left his battalion and sought safety in the state of Santa Catarina. During a family disagreement, Ramos' father attacked his mother, resulting in Ramos gravely stabbing his father with a knife, which ultimately resulted in his father's death a few days after the incident occurred. So Ramos moved to Rio Grande do Sul and worked as a police inspector in Porto Alegre, where he either purchased or rented an apartment on Rua do Arvoredo, now Rua Coronel Fernando Machado, 707, that had previously belonged to a butcher named Carlos Claussner. He would later be expelled from the police force after he was caught attempting to behead Domingos José da Costa, a notorious bandit revered as a Robin Hood-like figure who was captured in Vacaria in 1862, claiming he had attempted to escape. Ramos was expelled from the police force as a result of this incident. Ramos went on to work as a police informant after that. Ramos was a prominent member of Porto Alegre's high society, and he had a deep appreciation for lyrical music and poetry. He met Catarina Palse while attending a performance at the newly opened São Pedro Theatre, and the two later became engaged and married. Catarina Palse, his wife, was the primary conspirator in the murders, having been responsible for luring the victims to their home and then hiding their tracks. Palse grew up in a small village in Transylvania with his parents and two brothers, who came from a poor ethnic German family that lived in the Hungarian half of the country. When the Hungarian Revolution of 1848 erupted, she was subjected to indecent assault by soldiers and was forced to witness the murder of her entire family. Later, at the age of 15, she married Peter Palse solely for the purpose of fleeing the country and poverty she had grown up in. Her marriage was ended while she was on the trip when her husband took his own life by hanging himself. She arrived in Porto Alegre in 1857 when she was 20 years old. She ended up getting connected with José Ramos in 1863, and the two of them ended up moving in together on Rua do Arvoredo, which is near the cemetery behind the Metropolitan Cathedral of Our Lady Mother of God in Rio de Janeiro. Claussner was a German immigrant who established a butcher shop in front of the Church of Our Lady of Doors on Rua de Ponte, close to the city center, now Rua Riachuelo. Claussner was able to achieve financial success after his arrival in Brazil in 1859 and the creation of his shop as a result of the strategic position of his establishment. Claussner, on the other hand, was lonely, and when he met Ramos, who spoke German, the two became immediate friends, with Claussner later hiring Ramos as an apprentice. Starting in 1863, Ramos and Palse would gather in public places frequented by the city's elite to discuss who would make an acceptable victim. They would then proceed to murder that person. They preferred German immigrants because Palse was unable to communicate in Portuguese. Following the selection of the victim, Palse enticed them and scheduled appointments at the Bico de Pera, now Rua Uruguay. In exchange for their cooperation, she brought them to the home of Ramos, where they were robbed of their valuables and then beheaded, mutilated, and their skin was removed from them. Claussner's butcher shop eventually used the meat to make sausages, which were then sold to customers. In testimony from the time, Claussner recommended to Ramos that they do this in order to cover up any evidence. The bones would be dissolved in acid or burnt in the butcher shop, according to the testimony from the time. Although the actual number of victims is still unknown, it has been speculated that at least 6 males fell victim to the killers in this manner. In August 1863, a mystery sequence of disappearances sparked a panic in the city, prompting the authorities to launch an investigation into what had happened. Claussner began to be concerned about the possible implications of the deaths, and he made plans to depart to Uruguay, claiming that he was dissatisfied with his life in Porto Alegre. As a result, Ramos murdered his companion and buried his body in his backyard, fearful that his partner would inform the authorities. Claussner's business was subsequently taken over by the couple, and when Ramos was questioned about the whereabouts of the original owner, he stated that the store and residence had been sold to him. However, the company folded not long after, owing to the fact that neither Ramos nor Palse possessed the requisite competence to keep it functioning. The crimes were finally brought to light in 1864, following the disappearances of traveling salesman José Ignacio de Souza Vila and Portuguese merchant Januário Martins Ramos da Silva, both of whom had been last seen the day before at José Ramos' house in the city of Lisbon. In response to the men's summons to the police station for testimony, Ramos said that they had stayed overnight and had left for São Sebastião do Ceará the next morning. The delegate was dissatisfied with their responses and ordered that the residence be searched, which turned up proof of criminal activity. Different signs pointed to the fact that people had been slain in the house. The most damning of them were personal things belonging to the victims that Ramos had retained as keepsakes. Many bits of decomposing human body parts were discovered buried in the basement, which were eventually recognized as being Claussner's, during the hunt for the missing person. The mutilated remains of Januário and José Ignacio, as well as Ignacio's dog, which had its belly ripped open, were discovered in the well, as was the dog's owner. At the aftermath of being caught for additional crimes and becoming a mucker, Palse chose to confess that 6 men had been murdered in the house and that Carlos Claussner had later turned the victims' bodies into sausages. She kept a diary, which would eventually serve as a starting point for the investigation into the other deaths. Ramos and Palse murdered the victims in order to take their money, with the lone exception of José Ignacio de Souza Vila, who was murdered just for acting as a witness to the crime. When Ramos was arrested, Delegate Dario Rafael Collado, who was also the police chief and justice at the time, used him as a police informant, and in order to avoid humiliation, he accelerated the trial. The deputy, Silveira Martins, had already publicly criticized Collado for having conducted multiple illegal arrests, which led to the public attack. On many counts of robbery and murder, Justice Collado convicted José Ramos, who was sentenced to death by hanging. His sentence was eventually commuted to life imprisonment. Ramos maintained his innocence until his death at the Santa Casa de Misericordia Hospital in 1893. Palse, who has now been apprehended as an accomplice, was sentenced to 13 years in prison. On May 6, 1891, it was reported that she had been freed from prison after having completed her prison term. At the time, the event was extensively covered by the Porto Alegre press, with more exposure in international journals. The manufactured linguiças sold in Porto Alegre were met with exceptional acceptance, and as soon as this fact was made public, rumors about the case began to circulate. Those responsible for the Rua do Arvoredo murders have been deposited with the Brazilian National Archives in the city of Rio de Janeiro. A paucity of information, says historian Décio Freitas, author of the book The Greatest Crime on Earth, such as several sheets lost during the trial, records and manuscripts that are all in ancient Portuguese, according to Freitas. The reality remains that the crime was committed. Nevertheless, the evidence relating to sausages manufactured from human meat became implausible during the course of the trial and as time passed.